This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Alarms and Discursions by G.K. Chesterton. Section 9, Chapters 25 through 27. The Field of Blood. In my daily paper this morning I read the following interesting paragraphs, which take my mind back to an England which I do not remember, and which, therefore, perhaps, I admire. Nearly 60 years ago, on September 4th, 1850, the Australian General Haynau, who had gained an unenviable fame through the world by his ferocious methods in suppressing the Hungarian Revolution in 1849, while on a visit to this country, was belaboured in the streets of London by the draymen of Messrs. Barclay, Perkins and Company, whose brewery he had just inspected in company of an adjutant. Popular delight was so great that the government of the time did not dare to prosecute the assailants, and the General, the woman flogger as he was called by the people, had to leave these shores without remedy. He returned to his own country and settled upon his estate at Szekeres, which is close to the commune above mentioned. By his will the estate passed to his daughter, after whose death it was to be presented to the commune. This daughter had just died, but the communal council, after much deliberation, has declined to accept the gift, and ordered that the estate should be left to fall out of cultivation and be called the Bloody Meadow. Now that is an example of how things happen under an honest democratic impulse. I do not dwell especially on the earlier part of the story, though the earlier part of the story is astonishingly interesting. It recalls the days when Englishmen were potential lighters, that is, potential rebels. It is not for lack of agonies of intellectual anger. The Sultan and the late King Leopold have been denounced as heartily as General Haynau, but I doubt if they would have been physically thrashed in the London streets. It is not the tyrants that are lacking, but the draymen. Nevertheless, it is not upon the historic heroes of Barclay, Perkins and Company that I build all my hope. Fine as it was not a full and perfect revolution. A brewer's drayman beating an eminent European general with a stick, though a singularly bright and pleasing vision, is not a complete one. Only when the brewer's drayman beats the brewer with a stick shall we see the clear and radiant sunrise of British self-government. The fun will really start when we begin to thump the oppressors of England as well as the oppressors of Hungary. It is, however, a definite decline in the spiritual character of draymen that now they can thump neither one nor the other. But as I have already suggested, my real quarrel is not about the first part of the extract, but about the second. Whether or no the draymen of Barclay and Perkins have degenerated, the commune, which includes Szekeres, has not degenerated. By the way, the commune, which includes Szekeres, is called Kizerkes. I trust that this frank avowal will excuse me from the necessity of mentioning either of these places again by name. The commune is still capable of performing direct democratic actions, if necessary, with a stick. I say with a stick, not with sticks, for that is the whole argument about democracy. A people is a soul, and if you want to know what a soul is, I can only answer that it is something that can sin and that can sacrifice itself. A people can commit theft. A people can confess theft. A people can repent of theft. That is the idea of the Republic. Now, most modern people have got into their heads the idea that democracies are dull, drifting things, a mere black swarm or slide of clerks to their accustomed doom. In most modern novels and essays it is insisted, by way of contrast, that a walking gentleman may have adventures as he walks. It is insisted that an aristocrat can commit crimes because an aristocrat always cultivates liberty. But in truth a people can have adventures, as Israel did crawling through the desert to the promised land. A people can do heroic deeds. A people can commit crimes. The French people did both in the Revolution. The Irish people have done both in their much purer and more honourable progress. But the real answer to this aristocratic argument, which seeks to identify democracy with the drab utilitarianism, may be found in action such as that of the Hungarian Commune, whose name I decline to repeat. This Commune did just one of those acts that prove that a separate people has a separate personality. It threw something away. A man can throw a banknote into the fire. A man can fling a sack of corn into the river. The banknote may be burnt as a satisfaction of some scruple. The corn may be destroyed as a sacrifice to some god. But whenever there is sacrifice, we know there is a single will. Men may be disputatious and doubtful, may divide by very narrow majorities in their debate about how to gain wealth. But men have to be uncommonly unanimous in order to refuse wealth. It wants a very complete committee to burn a banknote in the office grate. It needs a highly religious tribe really to throw corn into the river. This self-denial is the test and definition of self-government. I wish I could feel certain that any English county council or parish council would be single enough to make that strong gesture of a romantic refusal, could say, "No rent shall be raised from this spot. No grain shall grow in this spot. No good shall come of this spot. It shall remain sterile for a sign." But I am afraid they might answer, like the eminent sociology in the story, that it was a whisk of spice. The strangeness of luxury. It is an English misfortune that what is called public spirit is so often a very private spirit. The legitimate but strictly individual ideals of this or that person who happens to have the power to carry them out. When these private principles are held by very rich people, the result is often the blackest and most repulsive kind of despotism, which is benevolent despotism. Obviously, it is the public which ought to have public spirit. But in this country and at this epoch, this is exactly what it has not got. We shall have a public washhouse and a public kitchen long before we have a public spirit. In fact, if we had a public spirit, we might very probably do without the other things. But if England were properly and naturally governed by the English, one of the first results would probably be this: that our standard of excess or defect in property would be changed from that of the plutocrat to that of the moderately needy man. That is, while property might be strictly respected, everything that is necessary to a clerk would be felt and considered on quite a different plane from anything which is a very great luxury to a clerk. This sane distinction of sentiment is not instinctive at present, because our standard of life is that of the governing class, which is eternally turning luxuries into necessities as fast as pork is turned into sausages, and which cannot remember the beginning of its needs and cannot get to the end of its novelties. Take, for the sake of argument, the case of the motor. Doubtless the Duke now feels it as necessary to have a motor as to have a roof, and in a little while he may feel it equally necessary to have a flying ship. But this does not prove, as the reactionary sceptics always argue, that a motor really is just as necessary as a roof. It only proves that a man can get used to an artificial life. It does not prove that there is no natural life for him to get used to. In the broad's eye view of common sense, there abides a huge disproportion between the need for a roof and the need for an aeroplane, and no rush of inventions can ever alter it. The only difference is that things are now judged by the abnormal needs when they might be judged merely by the normal needs. The best aristocrat sees the situation from an aeroplane. The good citizen, in his loftiest moments, goes no further than seeing it from the roof. It is not true that luxury is merely relative. It is not true that it is only an expensive novelty which we may afterwards come to think a necessity. Luxury has a firm philosophical meaning, and where there is a real public spirit, luxury is generally allowed for, sometimes rebuked, but always recognized instantly. To the healthy soul there is something in the very nature of certain pleasures which warns us that they are exceptions, and that if they become the rules, they will become very tyrannical rules. Take a harassed seamstress out of the Harrow Road, and give her one lightning hour in a motor car, and she will probably feel it is as splendid, but strange, rare, and even terrible. But this is not, as the relativists say, merely because she has never been in a car before. She has never been in the middle of a Somerset cowslip meadow before, but if you put her there she does not think it terrifying or extraordinary, but merely pleasant and free and a little lonely. She does not think the motor monstrous because it is new. She thinks it is monstrous because she has eyes in her head. She thinks it is monstrous because it is monstrous. That is, her mothers and grandmothers and the whole race by whose life she lives have had, as a matter of fact, a roughly recognizable model of living. Sitting in a green field was a part of it. Travelling as quick as a cannon ball was not. And we should not look down on the seamstress because she mechanically emits a short, sharp scream whenever the motor begins to move. On the contrary, we ought to look up to the seamstress and regard her cry as a kind of mystic omen or revelation of nature, as the old Goths used to consider the howls emitted by chance females when annoyed. For that ritual yell is really a mark of moral health, of swift response to the stimulations and changes of life. The seamstress is wiser than all the learned ladies, precisely because she can still feel that a motor is a different sort of thing from a meadow. By the accident of her economic imprisonment, it is even possible that she may have seen more of the former than the latter. But this has not shaken her cyclopean sagacity as to which is the natural thing and which the artificial. If not for her, at least for humanity as a whole, there is little doubt about which is the more normally attainable. It is considerably cheaper to sit in a meadow and see motors go by than to sit in a motor and see meadows go by. To me personally, at least, it would never seem needful to own a motor any more than to own an avalanche. An avalanche, if you have luck, I am told, is a very swift, successful, and thrilling way of coming down a hill. It is distinctly more stirring, say, than a glacier, which moves an inch in 100 years. But I do not divide these pleasures either by excitement or convenience, but by the nature of the thing itself. It seems human to have a horse or a bicycle, because it seems human to potter about, and men cannot work horses, nor can bicycles work men, enormously far of their ordinary haunts and affairs. But about motoring there is something magical, like going to the moon. And I say the thing should be kept exceptional and felt as something breathless and bizarre. My ideal hero would own his horse, but would have the moral courage to hire his motor. Fairy tales are the only sound guide-books to life. I like the fairy prince to ride on a white pony out of his father's stables, which are of ivory and gold. But if, in the course of his adventures, he finds it necessary to travel on a flaming dragon, I think he ought to give the dragon back to the witch at the end of the story. It is a mistake to have dragons about the place. For there is truly an air of something weird about luxury, and it is by this that healthy human nature has always smelt and suspected it. All romances that deal in extreme luxury, from the Arabian Nights to the novels Ouida and Disraeli, have, it may be noted, a singular air of dream and occasionally of nightmare. In such imaginative debauches there is something as occasional as intoxication, if that is still counted occasional. Life in those preposterous palaces would be an agony of dulness. It is clear we are meant to visit them only as in a flying vision. And what is true of the old freaks of wealth, flavour, and fierce colour and smell, I would say also of the new freak of wealth, which is speed. I should say to the Duke, when I entered his house at the head of an armed mob, "I do not object to your having exceptional pleasures, if you have them exceptionally. I do not mind your enjoying the strange and alien energies of science, if you feel them strange and alien, and not your own. But in condemning you, under the 7th section of the 8th decree of the Republic, to hire a motor car twice a year at Margate, I am not the enemy of your luxuries, but rather the protector of them." That is what I should say to the Duke. As to what the Duke would say to me, that is another matter, and may well be deferred. The Triumph of the Donkey. Doubtless the unsympathetic might state my doctrine that one should not own a motor like a horse, but rather use it like a flying dragon, in the simpler form that I will always go motoring in somebody else's car. My favourite modern philosopher, Mr. W. W. Jacobs, describes a similar case of spiritual delicacy misunderstood. I have not the book at hand, but I think that Job Brown was reproaching Bill Chambers for wasteful drunkenness, and Henry Walker spoke up for Bill and said he scarcely ever had a glass but what someone else paid for it, and there was an unpleasantness all round then. Being less sensitive than Bill Chambers, or whoever it was, I will risk this rude perversion of my meaning, and concede that I was in a motor car yesterday, and the motor car most certainly was not my own, and the journey, though it contained nothing that is specially unusual on such journeys, had running through it a strain of the grotesque, which was at once wholesome and humiliating. The symbol of that influence was that ancient symbol of the humble and humorous, a donkey. When I first saw the donkey, I saw him in the sunlight as the unearthly gargoyle that he is. My friend had met me in his car, I repeat firmly, in his car, at the little painted station in the middle of the warm wet woods and hop fields of that western country. He proposed to drive me first to his house beyond the village before starting a longer spin of adventure, and we rattled through those rich green lanes which have in them something singularly analogous to fairy tales, whether the lanes produce the fairies or, as I believe, the fairies produce the lanes. All around in the glimmering hop yard stood those little hop kilns, like stunted and slanting spires. They looked like dwarfish churches; in fact, rather like many modern churches I could mention, churches all of them small and each of them a little crooked. In his elfin atmosphere we swung round a sharp corner, and halfway up a steep white hill we saw what looked at first like a tall black monster against the sun. It appeared to be a dark and dreadful woman walking on wheels and waving long ears like a bat's. A second glance told me that she was not the local witch in a state of transition; she was only one of the million tricks of perspective. She sat up in a small wheeled cart drawn by a donkey. The donkey's ears were set just behind her head, and the whole was black against the light. Perspective is really the comic element in everything. It has a pompous Latin name, but it is incurably Gothic and grotesque. One simple proof of this is that it is always left out of all dignified and decorative art. There is no perspective in the Elgin marbles, and even the essentially angular angles in mediaeval stained glass almost always, as it says in Patience, contrive to look both angular and flat. There is something intrinsically disproportionate and outrageous in the idea of the distant objects dwindling and growing dwarfish, the closer objects swelling enormously and intolerably. There is something frantic in the notion that one's own father, by walking a little way, can be changed by a blast of magic to a pygmy. There is something farcical in the fancy that nature keeps one's uncle in an infinite number of sizes according to where he is to stand. All soldiers in retreat turn into tin soldiers, all bears in rout into toy bears. as if on the ultimate horizon of the world everything was sardonically doomed to stand up laughable and little against heaven. It was for this reason that the old woman and her donkey struck us at first, when seen from behind, as one black grotesque. I afterwards had the chance of seeing the old woman, the cart, and the donkey fairly, in flank and in all their length. I saw the old woman and the donkey passant as they might have appeared heraldically on the shield of some heroic family. I saw the old woman and the donkey dignified, decorative, and flat, as they might have marched across the Elgin marbles. Seen thus under an equal light, there was nothing especially ugly about them. The cart was long and sufficiently comfortable. The donkey was stolid and sufficiently respectable. The old woman was lean but sufficiently strong, and even smiling in a sour, rustic manner. But seen from behind they looked like one black monstrous animal. The dark donkey cars seemed like dreadful wings, and the tall, dark back of the woman, erect like a tree, seemed to grow taller and taller till one could almost scream. Then we went by her with a blasting roar like a railway train, and fled from her over the brow of the hill to my friend's home. There we paused only for my friend to stock the car with some kind of picnic paraphernalia, and so started again, as it happened, by the way we had come. Thus it fell that we went shattering down that short, sharp hill again before the poor old woman and her donkey had managed to crawl to the top of it. And seeing them under a different light, I saw them very differently. Black against the sun they had seemed comic, but bright against the greenwood and grey cloud. They were not comic, but tragic. For there are not a few things that seem fantastic in the twilight, and in the sunlight are sad. I saw that she had a grand, gaunt mask of ancient honour and endurance, and wide eyes sharpened to two shining points, as if looking for that small hope on the horizon of human life. I also saw that her cart contained carrots. "Don't you feel, broadly speaking, a beast," I asked my friend, "when you go so easily and so fast?" For we had crashed by so that the crazy cart must have thrilled in every stick of it. My friend was a good man, and said, "Yes, but I don't think it would do her any good if I went slower." "No," I assented after reflection. "Perhaps the only pleasure we can give to her or any one else is to get out of their sight very soon." My friend availed himself of this advice in no niggard spirit. I felt as if we were fleeing for our lives in throttling fear after some frightful atrocity. In truth, there is only one difference left between the secrecy of the two social classes. The poor hide themselves in darkness, and the rich hide themselves in distance. They both hide. As we shot like a lost boat over a cataract down into a whirlpool of white roads far below, I saw afar a black dot crawling like an insect. I looked again. I could hardly believe it. There was the slow old woman with her slow old donkey still toiling along the main road. I asked my friend to slacken, but when he said of the car, "She's wanting to go," I knew it was all up with him. For when you have called a thing female, you have yielded to it utterly. We passed the old woman with a shock that must have shaken the earth if her head did not reel and her heart quail. I know not what they were made of. And when we had fled perilously on in the gathering dark, spurning hamlets behind us, I suddenly called out, "Why, what asses we are! Why, it is she that is brave, she and the donkey. We are safe enough. We are artillery and plate armour, and she stands up to us with matchwood and a snail. If you had grown old in a quiet valley, and people began firing cannon balls as big as cabs at you in your 70th year, wouldn't you jump?" And she never moved an eyelid. "Oh, we go very fast and very far, no doubt." As I spoke came a curious noise, and my friend, instead of going fast, began to go very slow. Then he stopped, he got out, and then he said, "I left the Stepney behind." The grey moths came out of the wood, and the yellow stars came out to crown it, as my friend, with the lucidity of despair, explained to me, on the soundest scientific principles, of course, that nothing would be any good at all. We must sleep the night in the lane, except in the very unlikely event of someone coming to carry a message to some town. Twice I thought I heard some tiny sound of such approach, and it died away like wind in the trees, and the motorist was already asleep when I heard it renewed and realized something certainly was approaching. I ran up to the road, and there it was. Yes, it and she. Thrice had she come, once comic and once tragic and once heroic. And when she came again it was as if in pardon on a pure errand of prosaic pity and relief. I am quite serious. I do not want you to laugh. It is not the first time a donkey has been received seriously, nor one riding a donkey with respect. The end of chapters 25 through 27. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Alarms and Discursions by G. K. Chesterton. Section 10, chapters 28 through 30. The Wheel. In a quiet and rustic, though fairly famous church in my neighbourhood, there is a window supposed to represent an angel on a bicycle. It does definitely and indisputably represent a nude youth sitting on a wheel, but there is enough complication in the wheel, and sanctity, I suppose, in the youth, to warrant this working description. It is a thing of florid Renaissance outline, and belongs to the highly pagan period which introduced all sorts of objects into ornament. Personally, I can believe in the bicycle more than in the angel. Men, they say, are now imitating angels in their flying machines; that is, not in any other respect that I have heard of. So perhaps the angel on the bicycle, if he is an angel and if it is a bicycle, was avenging himself by imitating man. If so, he showed that high order of intellect which is attributed to angels in the medieval books, though not always, perhaps, in the medieval pictures. For wheels are the mark of a man quite as much as wings are the mark of an angel. Wheels are the things that are as old as mankind and yet strictly peculiar to man, that are prehistoric but not prehuman. A distinguished psychologist who is well acquainted with physiology has told me that parts of himself are certainly levers, while other parts are probably pulleys, but that after feeling himself carefully all over, he cannot find a wheel anywhere. The wheel as a mode of movement is a purely human thing. On the ancient escutcheon of Adam, which, like much of the rest of his costume, has not yet been discovered, the heraldic emblem was a wheel puissant. As a mode of progress, I say it is unique. Many modern philosophers, like my friend before mentioned, are ready to find links between man and beast, and to show that man has been in all things the blind slave of his mother earth. Some, of a very different kind, are even eager to show it, especially if it can be twisted to the discredit of religion. But even the most eager scientists have often admitted in my hearing that they would be surprised if some kind of cow approached them moving solemnly on four wheels. Wings, fins, flappers, claws, hooves, webs, trotters, and all these, the fantastic families of the earth, come against us and close around us, fluttering and flapping and rustling and galloping and lumbering and thundering. But there is no sound of wheels. I remember dimly, if indeed I remember aright, that in some of those dark prophetic pages of Scripture that seem of cloudy purple and dusky gold, there is a passage in which the seer beholds a violent dream of wheels. Perhaps this was indeed the symbolic declaration of the spiritual supremacy of man. Whatever the birds may do above or the fishes beneath his ship, man is the only thing to steer, the only thing to be conceived as steering. He may make the birds his friends if he can. He may make the fishes his gods if he chooses. But most certainly he will not believe a bird at the masthead, and is hardly likely that he will even permit a fish at the helm. He is, as Swinburne says, helmsman and chief, and he is literally the man at the wheel. The wheel is an animal that is always standing on its head, only it does it so rapidly that no philosopher has ever found out which is its head. Or, if the phrase be felt as more exact, it is an animal that is always turning head over heels, and progressing by this principle. Some fish, I think, turn head over heels, supposing them, for the sake of argument, to have heels. I have a dog who nearly did it, and I did it once myself when I was very small. It was an accident, and, as delightful novelist Mr. De Morgan would say, it never can happen again. Since then no one has accused me of being upside down, except mentally, and I rather think that there is something to be said for that, especially as typified by the rotary symbol. A wheel is the sublime paradox. One part of it is always going forward, the other part always going back. Now this, as it happens, is highly similar to the proper condition of any human soul or any political state. Every sane soul or state looks at once backwards and forwards, and even goes backwards to come on. For those interested in revolt, as I am, I only say meekly that one cannot have a revolution without revolving. The wheel, being a logical thing, has reference to what is behind as well as what is before. It has, as every society should have, a part that perpetually leaps helplessly at the sky, and a part that perpetually bows down its head into the dust. Why should people be so scornful of us who stand on our heads? Bowing down one's head in the dust is a very good thing, the humble beginning of all happiness. When we have bowed our heads in the dust for a little time, the happiness comes, and then, leaving our heads in the humble and reverent position, we kick up our heels behind in the air. That is the true origin of standing on one's head, and the ultimate defence of paradox. The wheel humbles itself to be exalted, only it does it a little quicker than I do. 555. Life is full of a ceaseless shower of small coincidences, too small to be worth mentioning except for a special purpose, often too trifling even to be noticed, any more than we notice one snowflake falling on another. It is this that lends a frightful plausibility to all false doctrines and evil fads. There are always such crowds of accidental arguments for anything. If I said suddenly that historical truth is generally told by red-haired men, I have no doubt that 10 minutes' reflection, in which I decline to indulge, would provide me with a handsome list of instances in support of it. I remember a riotous argument about Bacon and Shakespeare, in which I offered quite at random to show that Lord Rosebery had written the works of Mr. W.B. Yeats. No sooner had I said the words than a torrent of coincidences rushed upon my mind. I pointed out, for instance, that Mr. Yeats' chief work was The Secret Rose. This may easily be paraphrased as The Quiet or Modest Rose, and so, of course, as The Primrose. A second after, I saw the same suggestion in the combination of Rose and Bury. If I had pursued the matter, who knows but I might have been a raving maniac by this time. We trip over these trivial repetitions and exactitudes at every turn, only they are too trivial even for conversation. A man named Williams did walk into a strange house and murder a man named William's son. It sounds like a sort of infanticide. A journalist of my acquaintance did move quite unconsciously from a place called Overstrand to a place called Overroads. When he had made this escape he was very properly pursued by a voting card from Battersea, on which the political agent, named Burn, asked him to vote for a political candidate named Burns. And when he did so another coincidence happened to him, rather a spiritual than a material coincidence, a mystical thing, a matter of a magic number. For a sufficient number of reasons the man I know went up to vote in Battersea in a drifting and even dubious frame of mind. As the train slid through swampy woods and sullen skies, there came into his empty mind those idle yet awful questions which come when the mind is empty. Fools make cosmic systems out of them. Knaves make profane poems out of them. Men try to crush them like ugly lust. Religion is only the responsible reinforcement of common courage and common sense. Religion only sets up the normal mood of health against the 100 moods of disease. But there is this about such ghastly empty enigmas, that they always have an answer to the obvious answer, the reply offered by daily reason. Suppose a man's children have gone swimming. Suppose he is suddenly throttled by the senseless fear that they are drowned. The obvious answer is, only one man in 1,000 has his children drowned. But a deeper voice, deeper being as deep as hell, answers, and why should not you be the 1,000th man? What is true of tragic doubt is also true of trivial doubt. The voter's guardian devil said to him, if you don't vote today you can do 15 things which will quite certainly do some good somewhere: please a friend, please a child, please a maddened publisher. And what good do you expect to do by voting? You don't think your man will get in by one vote, do you? To this he knew the answer of common sense. But if everybody said that, nobody would get in at all. And then there came that deeper voice from Hades. But you are not settling what everybody shall do, but what one person on one occasion shall do. If this afternoon you went your way about more solid things, how would it matter, and who would ever know? Yet somehow the voter drove on blindly through the blackening London roads, and found somewhere a tedious polling station, and recorded his tiny vote. The politician for whom the voter had voted got in by 555 votes. The voter read this the next morning at breakfast, being in a more cheery and expansive mood, and found something very fascinating, not merely in the fact of the majority, but even in the form of it. There was something symbolic about the 3 exact figures. One felt it might be a sort of motto or cipher. In the great book of seals and cloudy symbols there is just such a thundering repetition. 666 was the mark of the beast. 555 is the mark of the man, the triumphant tribune and citizen. A number so symmetrical as that really rises out of the region of science into the region of art. It is a pattern, like the egg and dart ornament, or the Greek key. One might edge a wallpaper or fringe a robe with a recurring decimal. And while the voter luxuriated in this light exactitude of the numbers, a thought crossed his mind, and he almost leapt to his feet. "Why, good heavens!" he cried. "I won that election, and it was won by 1 vote. But for me it would have been the despicable, broken-backed, disjointed, inharmonious figure 554. The whole artistic point would have vanished. The mark of the man would have disappeared from history. It was I who, with masterful hand, seized the chisel and carved the hieroglyph, complete and perfect. I clutched the trembling hand of destiny when it was about to make a dull square 4, and forced it to make a nice curly 5. Why, but for me the cosmos would have lost a coincidence." After this outburst the voter sat down and finished his breakfast. Ethandune. Perhaps you do not know where Ethandune is. Nor do I. Nor does anybody. That is where the somewhat sombre fun begins. I cannot even tell you for certain whether it is the name of a forest or a town or a hill. I can only say that in any case it is of the kind that floats and is unfixed. If it is a forest, it is one of those forests that march with a million legs, like the walking trees that were the doom of Macbeth. If it is a town, it is one of those towns that vanish like a city of tents. If it is a hill, it is a flying hill, like the mountain to which faith lends wings. Over a vast dim region of England this dark name of Ethandune floats like an eagle, doubtful where to swoop and strike. And indeed there were dark birds of prey enough over Ethandune, wherever it was. But now Ethandune itself has grown as dark and drifting as the black drifts of the birds. And yet without this word that you cannot fit with a meaning and hardly with a memory, you would be sitting in a very different chair at this moment, and looking at a very different tablecloth. As a practical modern phrase I do not commend it. If my private critics and correspondents, in whom I delight, should happen to address me G.K. Chesterton, post restante Ethandune, I fear their letters would not come to hand. If 200 commercial travellers should agree to discuss a business matter at Ethandune from 5 to 5:15, I am afraid they would grow old in the district as white-haired wanderers. To put it plainly, Ethandune is anywhere and nowhere in the Western Hills. It is an English mirage, and yet but for this doubtful thing you would have probably no Daily News on Saturday, and certainly no church on Sunday. I do not say that either of these two things is a benefit, but I do say that they are customs, and that you would not possess them except through this mystery. You would not have Christmas puddings, nor probably any puddings. You would not have Easter eggs, probably not poached eggs. I strongly suspect not scrambled eggs, and the best historians are decidedly doubtful about curried eggs. To cut a long story short, the longest of all stories, you would not have any civilization, far less any Christian civilization. And if in some moment of gentle curiosity you wish to know why you are the polished, sparkling, rounded, and wholly satisfactory citizen which you obviously are, then I can give you no more definite answer, geographical or historical, but only toll in your ears the tone of the uncaptured name, Ethandune. I will try to state quite sensibly why it is as important as it is. And yet even that is not easy. If I were to state the mere fact from history books, numbers of people would think it equally trivial and remote, like some war of the Picts and Scots. The point perhaps might be put this way. There is a certain spirit in the world which breaks everything off short. There may be magnificence in the smashing, but the thing is smashed. There may be a certain splendour, but the splendour is sterile. It abolishes all future splendours. I mean, to take a working example, York Minster covered with flames might happen to be quite as beautiful as York Minster covered with carvings, but the carvings produce more carvings. The flames produce nothing but a little black heap. When any act has this cul-de-sac quality, it matters little whether it is done by book or sword, by a clumsy battle axe or chemical bomb. The case is the same with ideas. The pessimist may be a proud figure when he curses all the stars. The optimist may be an even prouder figure when he blesses them all. But the real test is not in the energy, but in the effect. When the optimist has said, "All things are interesting," we are left free. We can be interested as much or as little as we please. But when the pessimist says, "No things are interesting," it may be a very witty remark, but it is the last witty remark that can be made on the subject. He has burnt his cathedral. He has had his blaze, and the rest is ashes. The sceptic, like bees, give their one sting and die. The pessimist must be wrong, because he says the last word. Now this spirit that denies and that destroys had at one period of history a dreadful epic of military superiority. They did burn York Minster, or at least places of the same kind. Roughly speaking, from the 7th century to the 10th, a dense tide of darkness, of chaos and brainless cruelty poured on these islands and on the western coasts of the continent, which well nigh cut them off from all the white man's culture for ever. And this is the final human test, that the very chiefs of that vague age were remembered or forgotten according to how they had resisted this almost cosmic raid. Nobody thought of the modern nonsense about races. Everybody thought of the human race and its highest achievements. Arthur was a Celt, and may have been a fabulous Celt, but he was a fable on the right side. Charlemagne may have been a Gaul or a Goth, but he was not a barbarian. He fought for the tradition against the barbarians, the Nihilists. And for this reason also, for this reason, in the last resort only, we call the saddest and in some ways the least successful of the Wessex kings by the title of Alfred the Great. Alfred was defeated by the barbarians again and again. He defeated the barbarians again and again, but his victories were almost as vain as his defeats. Fortunately, he did not believe in the time spirit or the trend of things or any such modern rubbish, and therefore kept pegging away. But while his failures and his fruitless successes have names still in use, such as Wilton, Basing and Dashdown, that last epic battle which really broke the barbarian has remained without a modern place or name, except that it was near Chippenham, where the Danes gave up their swords and were baptized. No one can pick out certainly the place where you and I were saved from being savages forever. But the other day, under a wild sunset and moonrise, I passed the place which is best reputed as Ethandune, a high, grim upland, partly bare and partly shaggy, like that savage and sacred spot in those great imaginative lines about the demon lover and the waning moon. The darkness, the red wreck of sunset, the yellow and lurid moon, the long fantastic shadows actually created that sense of monstrous incident which is the dramatic side of landscape. The bare grey slopes seemed to rush downhill like routed hosts. The dark clouds drove across like riven banners, and the moon was like a golden dragon, like the golden dragon of Wessex. As we crossed the tilt of the torn heath, I saw suddenly between myself and the moon a black, shapeless pile higher than a house. The atmosphere was so intense that I really thought of a pile of dead Danes with some phantom conqueror on the top of it. Fortunately, I was crossing these wastes with a friend who knew more history than I, and he told me that this was a barrow older than Alfred, older than the Romans, older perhaps than the Britons, and no man knew whether it was a wall or a trophy or a tomb. Ethandune is still a drifting name, but it gave me a queer emotion to think that, sword in hand, as the Danes poured with the torrents of their blood down to Chippenham, the great king may have lifted up his head and looked at that oppressive shape, suggestive of something, and yet suggestive of nothing. He may have looked at it as we did, and understood it as little as we. The end of chapters 28 through 30. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ararms and Discursions by G.K. Chesterton. Section 11, Chapters 31 through 33. The Flat Freak. Some time ago a subtropical dinner was given by some South African millionaire. I forget his name, and so very likely does he. The humour of this was so subtle and haunting that it has been imitated by another millionaire, who has given a North Pole dinner in a grand hotel, on which he managed to spend gigantic sums of money. I do not know how he did it. Perhaps they had silver for snow and great sapphires for lumps of ice. Anyhow, it seems to have cost rather more to bring the Pole to London than to take Peary to the Pole. All this, one would say, does not concern us. We do not want to go to the Pole or to the hotel. I, for one, cannot imagine which would be the more dreary and disgusting, the real North Pole or the sham one. But as a mere matter of psychology, that merry pastime, there is a question that is not unentertaining. Why is it that all this scheme of ice and snow leaves us cold? Why is it that you and I feel we would, on the whole, rather spend the evening with 2 or 3 stable boys in a pothouse than take part in that pallid and arctic joke? Why does the modern millionaire jest bore a man to death with the mere thought of it? That it does bore a man to death I take for granted, and shall do so until somebody writes to me in cold ink and tells me that he really thinks it is funny. Now, it is not a sufficient explanation to say that the joke is silly. All jokes are silly. That is what they are for. If you ask some sincere elemental person, a woman for instance, what she thinks of a good sentence from Dickens, she will say that it is too silly. When Mr. Weller, senior, assured Mr. Weller, junior, that the circumvented was a more tender word than circumscribed, the remark was at least as silly as it was sublime. It is in vain, then, to object to senseless jokes. The very definition of a joke is that it need have no sense, except that one wild and supernatural sense which we call the sense of humour. Humour is meant, in a literal sense, to make a game of man; that is, to dethrone him from his official dignity and hunt him like game. It is meant to remind us human beings that we have things about us as ungainly and ludicrous as the nose of the elephant or the neck of the giraffe. If laughter does not touch a sort of fundamental folly, it does not do its duty in bringing us back to an enormous and original simplicity. Nothing has been worse than the modern notion that a clever man can make a joke without taking part in it, without sharing in the general absurdity that such a situation creates. It is unpardonable conceit not to laugh at your own jokes. Joking is undignified. That is why it is so good for one's soul. Do not fancy you can be a detached wit and avoid being a buffoon. You cannot. If you are the court jester, you must be the court fool. Whatever it is, therefore, that wearies us in these wealthy jokes, like the North Pole dinner, it is not merely that men make fools of themselves. When Dickens describes Mr. Chuckster, Dickens was, strictly speaking, making a fool of himself, for he was making a fool out of himself. And every kind of real lark, from acting a charade to making a pun, does consist in restraining one's 999 serious selves and letting the fool loose. The dullness of the millionaire's joke is much deeper. It is not silly at all. It is solely stupid. It does not consist in ingenuity limited, but merely of inanity expanded. There is a considerable difference between a wit making a fool of himself and a fool making a wit of himself. The true explanation, I fancy, may be stated thus. We can all remember it in the case of the really inspiriting parties and fooleries of our youth. The only real fun is to have limited materials and a good idea. This explains the perennial popularity of impromptu private theatricals. These fascinate because they give such a scope for invention and variety, with the most domestic restriction of machinery. A tea cosy may have to do for an admiral's cocked hat. It all depends on whether the amateur actor can swear like an admiral. A hearthrug may have to do for a bear's fur. It all depends on whether the wearer is a polished and versatile man of the world and can grunt like a bear. A clergyman's hat, to my own private and certain knowledge, can be punched and thumped into an exact shape of a policeman's helmet. It all depends on the clergyman. I mean, it depends on his permission, his imprimatur, his nihil obstat. Clergymen can be policemen, rugs can rage like wild animals, tea cosies can smell of the sea, if only there is at the back of them all one bright and amusing idea. What is really funny about Christmas charades in any average home is that there is a contrast between commonplace resources and one comic idea. What is deadly dull about the millionaire banquet is that there is a contrast between colossal resources and no idea. That is the abyss of inanity in such feasts. It may be literally called a yawning abyss. The abyss, the vast chasm between the money power employed and the thing it is employed on. To make a big joke out of a broomstick, a barrow, and an old hat, that is great. But to make a small joke out of mountains of emeralds and tons of gold, surely that is humiliating. The North Pole is not a very good joke to start with. An icicle hanging on one's nose is a simple sort of humour in any case. If a set of spontaneous mummers got the effect cleverly with cut crystals from the early Victorian chandelier, there might really be something suddenly funny in it. But what should we say of hanging diamonds on 100 human noses, merely to make that precious joke about icicles? What can be more abject than the union of elaborate and research arrangements with an old and obvious point? The clown with its red-hot poker and the string of sausages is all very well in his way, but think of a string of pâté de foie gras sausages at a guinea apiece. Think of a red-hot poker cut out of a single ruby. Imagine such fantasticalities of expense with such a tameness and staleness of design. We may even admit the practical joke if it is domestic and simple. We may concede that apple pie beds and butter slides are sometimes useful things for the education of pompous persons living the higher life. But imagine a man making a butter slide and telling everybody it was made with the most expensive butter. Picture an apple pie bed of purple and cloth of gold. It is not hard to see that such schemes would lead simultaneously to a double boredom, weariness of the costly and complex method, and of the meagre and trivial thought. This is the true analysis, I think, of that chill and tedium that strikes to the soul of any intelligent man when he hears of such elephantine pranks. That is why we should feel that freak dinners would not even be freakish. That is why we feel that expensive Arctic feasts would probably be a frost. If it be said that such things do no harm, I hasten in one sense at least to agree. Far from it, they do good. They do good in the most vital manner of modern times, for they prove and print in huge letters the truth which our society must learn or perish. They prove that wealth in society, as now constituted, does not tend to get into the hands of the thrifty or the capable, but actually tends to get into the hands of wastrels and imbeciles. And it proves that the wealthy class of today is quite as ignorant about how to enjoy itself as about how to rule other people. That it cannot make its government govern or its education educate we may take as a trifling weakness of oligarchy. But pleasure we do look to see in such a class, and it has surely come to its decrepitude when it cannot make its pleasure please. The Garden of the Sea. One sometimes hears from persons of the chillier type of the culture the remark that plain country people do not appreciate the beauty of the country. This is an error rooted in the intellectual pride of mediocrity, and it is one of the many examples of a truth in the idea that extremes meet. Thus, to appreciate the virtues of the mob, one must either be on a level with it, as I am, or be really high up, like the saints. It is roughly the same with aesthetics. Slang and rude dialect can be relished by a really literary taste, but not by a merely bookish taste. And when these cultivated cranks say that rustics do not talk of nature in an appreciative way, they really mean that they do not talk in a bookish way. They do not talk bookishly about clouds or stones or pigs or slugs or horses or anything you please. They talk piggishly about pigs, and sluggishly, I suppose, about slugs, and are refreshingly horsey about horses. They speak in a stony way of stones, and they speak in a cloudy way of clouds, and this is surely the right way. And if by any chance a simple, intelligent person from the country comes in contact with any aspect of nature unfamiliar and arresting, such a person's comment is always worth remark. It is sometimes an epigram, and at worst it is never a quotation. Consider, for instance, what waste of words, imitation, and ambiguity the ordinary educated person in the big towns could pour out on the subject of the sea. A country girl I know in the county of Buckingham had never seen the sea in her life until the other day. When she was asked what she thought of it, she said it was like cauliflowers. Now that is a piece of pure literature, vivid, entirely independent and original, and perfectly true. I had always been haunted with an analogous kinship which I could never locate. Cabbages always remind me of the sea, and the sea always reminds me of cabbages. It is partly, perhaps, the veined mingling of violet and green, as in the sea a purple that is almost dark red may mix with a green that is almost yellow, and still be the blue sea as a whole. But it is more the grand curves of the cabbage that curl over cavernously like waves, and it is partly again that dreamy repetition as of a pattern that made two great poets, Aeschylus and Shakespeare, use a word like multitudinous of the ocean. But just where my fancy halted, the Buckinghamshire young woman rushed, so to speak, to my imaginative rescue. Cauliflowers are 20 times better than cabbages, for they show the wave-breaking as well as curling, and the efflorescence of the branching foam, blind, bubbling, and opaque. Moreover, the strong lines of life are suggested. The arches of the rushing waves have all the rigid energy of green stalks, as if the whole sea were one great green plant with one immense white flower rooted in the abyss. Now, a large number of delicate and superior persons would refuse to see the force in that kitchen-garden comparison, because it is not connected with any of the ordinary maritime sentiments as stated in books and songs. The aesthetic amateur would say that he knew what large and philosophical thoughts he ought to have by the boundless deep. He would say that he was not a greengrocer who would think first of greens. To which I should reply, like Hamlet, apropos of a parallel profession, I would you were so honest a man. The mention of Hamlet reminds me, by the way, that besides the girl who had never seen the sea, I knew a girl who had never seen a stage play. She was taken to Hamlet, and she said it was very sad. There is another case of going to the primordial point which is overlaid by learning and secondary impressions. We are so used to thinking of Hamlet as a problem that we sometimes quite forget that it is a tragedy, just as we are so used to thinking of the sea as vast and vague that we scarcely notice when it is white and green. But there is another quarrel involved in which the young gentleman of our culture comes into violent collision with the young lady of the cauliflowers. The first essential of the merely bookless view of the sea is that it is boundless and gives a sentiment of infinity. Now, it is quite certain, I think, that the cauliflower simile was partly created by exactly the opposite impression. the impression of boundary and of barrier. The girl thought of it as a field of vegetables, even as a yard of vegetables. The girl was right. The ocean only suggests infinity when you cannot see it. A sea mist may seem endless, but it is not a sea. So far from being vague and vanishing, the sea is the one hard straight line in nature. It is the one plain limit, the only thing that God has made that really looks like a wall. Compared to the sea, not only sun and cloud are chaotic and doubtful, but solid mountains and standing forests may be said to melt and fade and flee in the presence of that lonely iron line. The old naval phrase that the seas are England's bulwarks is not a frigid and artificial metaphor. It came into the head of some genuine sea dog when he was genuinely looking at the sea. For the edge of the sea is like the edge of a sword. It is sharp, military, and decisive. It really looks like a bolt or bar, and not like a mere expansion. It hangs in heaven, grey or green or blue, changing in colour, but changeless in form, behind all the slippery contours of the land and all the savage softness of the forests, like the scales of God held even. It hangs a perpetual reminder of that divine reason and justice which abides behind all compromises and all legitimate variety, the one straight line, the limit of the intellect, the dark and ultimate dogma of the world. The Sentimentalist. Sentimentalism is the most broken reed on which righteousness can lean. These were, I think, the exact words of a distinguished American visitor at the Guildhall, and may heaven forgive me if I do him a wrong. It was spoken in illustration of the folly of supporting Egyptian and other Oriental nationalism, and it has tempted me to some reflections on the first word of the sentence. The sentimentalist, roughly speaking, is the man who wants to eat his cake and have it. He has no sense of honour about ideas. He will not see that one must pay for an idea as for anything else. He will not see that any worthy idea, like an honest woman, can only be won on its own terms and with its logical chain of loyalty. One idea attracts him, another idea really inspires him, a third idea flatters him, a fourth idea pays him. He will have them all at once in one wild intellectual harem, no matter how much they quarrel and contradict each other. The sentimentalist is a philosophic profligate, who tries to capture every mental beauty without reference to its rival beauties, who will not even be off with the old love before he is on with the new. Thus, if a man were to say, "I love this woman, but I may some day find my affinity in some other woman," he would be a sentimentalist. He would be saying, "I will eat my wedding cake and keep it." Or if a man should say, "I am a Republican, believing in the equality of citizens, but when the government has given me my peerage, I can do infinite good as a kind of landlord and wise legislator," then that man would be a sentimentalist. He would be trying to keep at the same time the classic austerity of equality and also the vulgar excitement of an aristocrat. Or if a man should say, "I am in favour of religious equality, but I must preserve the Protestant succession," he would be a sentimentalist of a grosser and more improbable kind. This is the essence of the sentimentalist, that he seeks to enjoy every idea without its sequence and every pleasure without its consequence. Now, it would really be hard to find a worse case of this inconsequent sentimentalism than the theory of the British Empire advanced by Mr. Roosevelt himself in his attack on sentimentalists. For the imperial theory, the Roosevelt and Kipling theory of our relation to Eastern races, is simply one of eating the Oriental cake, I suppose the Sultana cake, and at the same time leaving it alone. Now, there are two sane attitudes of a European statesman towards Eastern peoples, and there are only two. First, he may simply say that the less we have to do with them, the better; that whether they are lower than us or higher, they are so catastrophically different that the more we go our way and they go theirs, the better for all parties concerned. I will confess to some tenderness for this view. There is much to be said for letting that calm immemorial life of slave and sultan, temple and palm tree flow on as it has always flowed. The best reason of all, the reason that affects me most finely, is that if we left the rest of the world alone, we might have some time for attending to our own affairs, which are urgent to the point of excruciation. All history points to this, that intensive cultivation in the long run triumphs over the widest extensive cultivation. Or, in other words, that making one's own field superior is far more effective than reducing other people's fields to inferiority. If you cultivate your own garden and grow an especially large cabbage, people will probably come to see it, whereas the life of one selling small cabbages round the whole district is often forlorn. Now, the imperial pioneer is essentially a commercial traveller, and a commercial traveller is essentially a person who goes to see people because they don't want to see him. As long as empires go about urging their ideas on others, I always have a notion that the ideas are no good. If they were really so splendid, they would make the country preaching them a wonder of the world. That is the true ideal. A great nation ought not to be a hammer but a magnet. Men went to the medieval Sorbonne because it was worth going to. Men went to old Japan because only there could they find the unique and exquisite old Japanese art. Nobody will ever go to modern Japan, nobody worth bothering about, I mean, because modern Japan has made the huge mistake of going to the other people, becoming a common empire. The mountain has condescended to Mahomet, and henceforth Mahomet will whistle for it when he wants it. That is my political theory, that we should make England worth copying instead of telling everybody to copy her. But it is not the only possible theory. There is another view of our relations to such places as Egypt and India which is entirely tenable. It may be said we Europeans are the heirs of the Roman Empire. When all is said, we have the largest freedom, the most exact science, the most solid romance. We have a deep though undefined obligation to give as we have received from God, because the tribes of men are truly thirsting for these things as for water. All men really want clear laws. We can give clear laws. All men really want hygiene. We can give hygiene. We are not merely imposing Western ideas, we are simply fulfilling human ideas for the first time. On this line, I think, it is possible to justify the forts of Africa and the railroads of Asia. But on this line we must go much further. If it is our duty to give our best, there can be no doubt about what is our best. The great thing our Europe has made is the citizen, the idea of the average man, free and full of honour, voluntarily invoking on his own sin the just vengeance of his city. All else we have done is mere machinery for that. Railways exist only to carry the citizen, forts only to defend him, electricity only to light him, medicine only to heal him. Popularism, the idea of the people alive and patiently feeding history, that we cannot give, for it exists everywhere, east and west. But democracy, the idea of the people fighting and governing, that is the only thing we have to give. Those are the two roads, but between them weakly wavers the sentimentalist, that is, the imperialist of the Roosevelt school. He wants to have it both ways, to have the splendours of success without the perils. Europe may enslave Asia because it is flattering, but Europe must not free Asia because that is responsible. It tickles his imperial taste that the Hindus should have European hats. It is too dangerous if they have European heads. He cannot leave Asia Asiatic, yet he dares not contemplate Asia as European. Therefore he proposes to have in Egypt railway signals, but not flags; dispatch boxes, but not ballot boxes. In short, the sentimentalist decides to spread the body of Europe without the soul. End of chapters 31 through 33. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Alarms and Discursions by G.K. Chesterton. Section 12, chapters 34 through 36. The White Horses. It is within my experience, which is very brief and occasional in this matter, that it is not really at all easy to talk in a motor car. This is unfortunate, first, because as a whole it prevents me from motoring, and second, because at any given moment it prevents me from talking. The difficulty is not wholly due to the physical conditions, though these are distinctly unconversational. Fitzgerald's Omar, being a pessimist, was probably rich, and being a lazy fellow, was almost certainly a motorist. If any doubt could exist on the point, it is enough to say that, in speaking of the foolish prophets, Omar has defined the difficulties of colloquial motoring with a precision which cannot be accidental. Their words to wind are scattered, and their mouths are stopped with dust. From this follows, not as many of the cut-and-dried philosophers would say, a savage silence and mutual hostility, but rather one of those rich silences that make the mass and bulk of all friendship, the silence of men rowing the same boat or fighting in the same battle line. It happened that the other day I hired a motor car because I wanted to visit in very rapid succession the battle places and hiding places of Alfred the Great, and for a thing of this sort a motor is really appropriate. It is not by any means the best way of seeing the beauty of the country. You see beauty better by walking, and best of all by sitting still. But it is a good method in any enterprise that involves a parody of the military or governmental quality, anything which needs to know quickly the whole contour of a country or the rough relative position of men and towns. On such a journey like jagged lightning, I sat from morning till night by the side of the chauffeur, and we scarcely exchanged a word to the hour. By the time the yellow stars came out in the villages and the white stars in the skies, I think I understood his character, and I fear he understood mine. He was a Cheshire man, with a sour, patient, humorous face. He was modest, though a North countryman, and genial, though an expert. He spoke, when he spoke at all, with a strong Northland accent, and he evidently was new to the beautiful South country, as was clear both from his approval and his complaints. But though he came from the North, he was agricultural and not commercial in origin. He looked at the land rather than the towns, even if he looked at it with somewhat more sharp and utilitarian eye. His first remark for some hours was uttered when we were crossing the more coarse and desolate heights of Salisbury Plain. He remarked that he had always thought that Salisbury Plain was a plain. This alone showed that he was new to the vicinity. But he also said, with a critical frown, "A lot of this land ought to be good land enough. Why don't they use it?" He was then silent for some more hours. At an abrupt angle of the slopes that lead down from what is called, with no little humour, Salisbury Plain, I suddenly saw, as by accident, something I was looking for; that is, something I did not expect to see. We are all supposed to be trying to walk into heaven, but we should be uncommonly astonished if we suddenly walked into it. As I was leaving Salisbury Plain, to put it roughly, I lifted up my eyes and saw the White Horse of Britain. One or two truly fine poets of the Tory and Protestant type, such as Swinburne and Mr. Rudyard Kipling, have eulogized England under the image of white horses, meaning the white-maned breakers of the Channel. This is right and natural enough. The true philosophical Tory goes back to ancient things because he thinks they will be anarchic things. It would startle him very much to be told that there are white horses of artifice in England that may be older than those wild white horses of the elements. Yet it is truly so. Nobody knows how old are those strange green and white hieroglyphs, those straggling quadrupeds of chalk that stand out on the sides of so many of the southern downs. They are possibly older than Saxon and older than Roman times. They may well be older than British, older than any recorded times. They may go back, for all we know, to the first faint seeds of human life on this planet. Men may have picked a horse out of the grass long before they scratched a horse on a vase or a pot, or masked and masked any horse out of clay. This may be the oldest human art, before building or graving, and if so, it may have first happened in another geological age, before the sea burst through the narrow Straits of Dover. The white horse may have begun in Berkshire, when there were no white horses at Folkestone or Newhaven. That rude but evident white outline that I saw across the valley may have begun when Britain was not an island. We forget that there are many places where art is older than nature. We took a long detour through somewhat easier roads till we came to a breach or chasm in the valley, from which we saw our friend the white horse once more. At least we thought it was our friend the white horse, but after a little inquiry we discovered to our astonishment that it was another friend and another horse. Along the leaning flanks of the same fair valley there was, it seemed, another white horse, as rude and as clean, as ancient and as modern as the first. This, at least, I thought, must be the aboriginal white horse of Alfred, which I had always heard associated with his name. And yet before we had driven into the Wantage and seen King Alfred's quaint grey statue in the sun, we had seen yet a third white horse. And the third white horse was so hopelessly unlike a horse that we were sure that it was genuine. The final and original white horse, the white horse of the White Horse Vale, has that big babyish quality that truly belongs to our remotest ancestors. It really has the prehistoric, preposterous quality of Zulu or New Zealand native drawings. This, at least, was surely made by our fathers when they were barely men, long before they were civilized men. But why was it made? Why did barbarians take so much trouble to make a horse nearly as big as a hamlet, a horse who could bear no hunter, who could drag no loads? What was this titanic subconscious instinct for spoiling a beautiful green slope with a very ugly white quadruped? What, for the matter of that, is this whole hazardous fancy of humanity ruling the earth, which may have begun with white horses, which may by no means end with 20-horsepower cars? As I rolled away out of that country I was still cloudily considering how ordinary men ever came to want to make such strange chalk horses, when my chauffeur startled me by speaking for the first time for nearly 2 hours. He suddenly let go one of the handles and pointed at a gross green bulk of down that happened to swell above us. "That would be a good place," he said. Naturally, I referred to his last speech of some hours before, and supposed that he meant it would be promising for agriculture. As a fact, it was quite unpromising, and this made me suddenly understand the quiet ardour in his eye. All of a sudden I saw what he really meant. He really meant that this would be a splendid place to pick out another white horse. He knew no more than I did why it was done, but he was in some unthinkable prehistoric tradition, because he wanted to do it. He became so acute in sensibility that he could not bear to pass any broad breezy hill of grass on which there was not a white horse. He could hardly keep his hands off the hills. He could hardly leave any of the living grass alone. Then I left off wondering why this primitive man made so many white horses. I left off troubling in what sense the ordinary eternal man had sought to scar or deface the hills. I was content to know that he did want it, for I had seen him wanting it. The Long Bow. I find myself still sitting in front of the last book by Mr. H. G. Wells. I say stunned with admiration. My family says sleepy with fatigue. I still feel vaguely all the things in Mr. Wells' book which I agree with, and I still feel vividly the one thing that I deny. I deny that biology can destroy the sense of truth, which alone can even desire biology. No truth which I find can deny that I am seeking the truth. My mind cannot find anything which denies my mind. But what is all this? This is no sort of talk for a genial essay. Let us change the subject. Let us have a romance or a fable or a fairy tale. Come, let us tell each other stories. There once was a king who was very fond of listening to stories, like the king in the Arabian Nights. The only difference was that, unlike that cynical Oriental, this king believed all the stories that he heard. It is hardly necessary to add that he lived in England. His face had not the swarthy secrecy of the tyrant of the thousand tales. On the contrary, his eyes were as big and innocent as two blue moons, and when his yellow beard turned totally white he seemed to be growing younger. Above him hung still his heavy sword and horn, to remind men that he had been a tall hunter and warrior in his time. Indeed, with that rusted sword he had wrecked armies. But he was one of those who will never know the world, even when they conquer it. Besides his love of this old Chaucerian pastime of telling tales, he was, like many old English kings, specially interested in the art of the bow. He gathered round him great archers of the stature of Ulysses and Robin Hood, and to 4 of these he gave the whole government of his kingdom. They did not mind governing his kingdoms, but they were sometimes a little bored with the necessity of telling him stories. None of their stories were true, but the king believed all of them, and this became very depressing. They created the most preposterous romances, and could not get the credit of creating them. Their true ambition was sent empty away. They were praised as archers, but they desired to be praised as poets. They were trusted as men, but they would rather have been admired as literary men. At last, in an hour of desperation, they formed themselves into a club or conspiracy with the object of inventing some story which even the king could not swallow. They called it the League of the Long Bow, thus attaching themselves by a double bond to their motherland of England, which has been steadily celebrated since the Norman Conquest for its heroic archery and for the extraordinary credulity of its people. At last it seemed to the 4 archers that their hour had come. The king commonly sat in a green curtained chamber, which opened by 4 doors and was surmounted by 4 turrets. Summoning his champions to him on an April evening, he sent out each of them by a separate door, telling him to return at morning with a tale of his journey. Every champion bowed low, and girding on great armour as for awful adventures, retired to some part of the garden to think of a lie. They did not want to think of a lie which would deceive the king. Any lie would do that. They wanted to think of a lie so outrageous that it could not deceive him, and that was a serious matter. The first archer who returned was a dark, quiet, clever fellow, very dexterous in small matters of mechanics. He was more interested in the science of the bow than in the sport of it. Also, he would only shoot at a mark, for he thought it cruel to kill beasts and birds, and atrocious to kill men. When he left the king, he had gone out into the wood and tried all sorts of tiresome experiments about the bending of branches and the impact of arrows. When even he found it tiresome, he returned to the house of the 4 turrets and narrated his adventure. "Well," said the king, "what have you been shooting?" "Arrows," answered the archer. "So I suppose," said the king, smiling. "But I mean, what wild things have you shot?" "I have shot nothing but arrows," answered the bowman obstinately. "When I went on out to the plain I saw in a crescent the black army of the Tartars, the terrible archers whose bows are of bended steel, and their bolts as big as javelins. They spied me afar off, and the shower of their arrows shut out the sun and made a rattling roof above me. You know I think it wrong to kill a bird or worm or even a Tartar. But such is the precision and rapidity of perfect science that with my own arrows I split every arrow as it came against me. I struck every flying shaft as if it were a flying bird. Therefore, sire, I may say truly that I shot nothing but arrows." The king said, "I know how clever you engineers are with your fingers." The archer said, "Oh," and went out. The second archer, who had curly hair and was pale, poetical, and rather effeminate, had merely gone out into the garden and stared at the moon. When the moon had become too wide, blank, and watery even for his own wide, blank, and watery eyes, he came in again, and when the king said, "What have you been shooting?" he answered with great volubility, "I have shot a man, not a man from Tartary, not a man from Europe, Asia, Africa, or America, not a man on this earth at all. I have shot the man in the moon." "Shot the man in the moon," repeated the king with something like mild surprise. "It is easy to prove it," said the archer with hysterical haste. "Examine the moon through this particularly powerful telescope, and you will no longer find any trace of a man there." The king glued his big blue idiotic eye to the telescope for about 10 minutes, and then said, "You are right, as you have often pointed out. Scientific truth can only be tested by the senses. I believe you." And the second archer went out, and being of a more emotional temperament, burst into tears. The third archer was a savage, brooding sort of man, with tangled hair and dreamy eyes, and he came in without any preface, saying, "I have lost all my arrows. They have turned into birds." Then, as he saw that they all stared at him, he said, "Well, you know, everything changes on earth. Mud turns into marigolds, eggs turn into chickens. One can even breed dogs into quite different shapes. Well, I shot my arrows at the awful eagles that clashed their wings round the Himalayas, great golden eagles as big as elephants, which snapped the tall trees by perching on them. My arrows fled so far over mountains and valleys that they turned slowly into fowls in their flight. See here," and he threw down a dead bird and laid an arrow beside it. "Can you see they are the same structure? The straight shaft is the backbone, the sharp point is the beak, the feather is the rudimentary plumage. It is merely modification and evolution." After a silence the king nodded gravely and said, "Yes, of course, everything is evolution." At this the third archer suddenly and violently left the room, and was heard in some distant part of the building making extraordinary noises, either of sorrow or of mirth. The fourth archer was a stunted man with a face as dead as wood, but with wicked little eyes close together and very much alive. His comrades dissuaded him from going in because they said that they had soared up into the seventh heaven of living lies, and that there was literally nothing which the old man would not believe. The face of the little archer became a little more wooden as he forced his way in, and when he was inside he looked round with blinking bewilderment. "Ha! the last," said the king heartily. "Welcome back again." There was a long pause, and then the stunted archer said, "What do you mean by again? I have never been here before." The king stared for a few seconds and said, "I sent you out from this room with the 4 doors last night." After another pause the little man slowly shook his head. "I never saw you before," he said simply. "You never sent me out from anywhere. I only saw your 4 turrets in the distance and strayed in here by accident. I was born in an island in the Greek archipelago. I am by profession an auctioneer, and my name is Punk." The king sat on his throne for 7 long instants like a statue, and then there awoke in his mild and ancient eyes an awful thing, the complete conviction of untruth. Every one has felt it who has found a child obstinately false. He rose to his height and took down the heavy sword above him, plucked it out naked, and then spoke. "I will believe your mad tales about the exact machinery of arrows, for that is science. I will believe your mad tales about traces of life in the moon, for that is science. I will believe your mad tales about jellyfish turning into gentlemen, and everything turning into anything, for that is science. But I will not believe you when you tell me what I know to be untrue. I will not believe you when you say that you did not set forth under my authority and out of my house. The other 3 may conceivably have told the truth, but this last man has certainly lied. Therefore I will kill him." And with that the old and gentle king ran at the man with uplifted sword. But he was arrested by the roar of happy laughter, which told the world that there is, after all, something which an Englishman will not swallow. The Modern Scrooge. Mr. Vernon Smith, of Trinity and the Social Settlement, Tooting, author of A Higher London and the Boyg System at Work, came to the conclusion, after looking through his select and even severe library, that Dickens's Christmas Carol was a very suitable thing to be read to charwomen. Had they been men, they would have been forcibly subjected to Browning's Christmas Eve, with exposition. But chivalry spared the charwomen, and Dickens was funny and could do no harm. His fellow worker Wimpole would read things like 3 Men in a Boat to the poor, but Vernon Smith regarded this as a sacrifice of principle, or what was the same thing to him, of dignity. He would not encourage them in their vulgarity. They should have nothing from him that was not literature. Still, Dickens was literature after all, not literature of a high order, of course, not thoughtful or purposeful literature, but literature quite fitted for charwomen on Christmas Eve. He did not, however, let them absorb Dickens without due antidotes of warning and criticism. He explained that Dickens was not a writer of the first rank, since he lacked the high seriousness of Matthew Arnold. He also feared that they would find the characters of Dickens terribly exaggerated. But they did not, possibly because they were meeting them every day. For among the poor there are still exaggerated characters. They do not go to the universities to be universified. He told charwomen with progressive brightness that a mad, wicked old miser like Scrooge would be really quite impossible now. But as each of the charwomen had an uncle or a grandfather or a father-in-law who was exactly like Scrooge, his cheerfulness was not shared. Indeed, the lecture as a whole lacked something of his firm and elastic touch, and toward the end he found himself rambling and in a sort of abstraction, talking to them as if they were his fellows. He caught himself saying quite mystically that a spiritual plane, by which he meant his plane, always looked to those on the sensual, or the Dickens plane, not merely austere, but desolate. He said, quoting Bernard Shaw, that we could all go to heaven as we can all go to a classical concert, but if we did it would bore us. Realizing that he was taking his flock far out of their depth, he ended somewhat hurriedly, and was soon receiving that generous applause which is part of the profound ceremonialism of the working classes. As he made his way to the door, 3 people stopped him and answered him heartily enough, but with an air of hurry which he would not have dreamed of showing to people of his own class. One was a little schoolmistress, who told him with a sort of feverish meekness that she was troubled because an ethical lecturer had said that Dickens was not really progressive, but she thought he was progressive, and surely he was progressive. Of what being progressive was she had no more notion than a whale. The second person implored him for a subscription to some soup kitchen or cheap meal, and his refined features sharpened, for this, like literature, was a matter of principle with him. Quite the wrong method, he said, shaking his head and pushing past. Nothing any good but the Boyg system. The third stranger, who was male, caught him on the step as he came out into the snow and starlight, and asked him point blank for money. It was a part of Vernon Smith's principles that all such persons are prosperous impostors, and like a true mystic he held to his principles in defiance of his five senses, which told him that the night was freezing, the man very thin and weak. "If you come to the settlement between 4 and 5 on Friday week," he said, "inquiries will be made." The man stepped back into the snow with a not ungraceful gesture as of apology. He had frosty silver hair, and his lean face, though in shadow, seemed to wear something like a smile. As Vernon Smith stepped briskly into the street, the man stooped down as if to do up his bootlace. He was, however, guiltless of any such dandyism, and as the young philanthropist stood pulling on his gloves with some particularity, a heavy snowball was suddenly smashed into his face. He was blind for a black instant, and then, as some of the snow fell, saw faintly, as in a dim mirror of ice or dreamy crystal, the lean man bowing with the elegance of a dancing master, and saying amiably, "A Christmas box." When he had quite cleared his face of snow, the man had vanished. For 3 burning minutes Cyril Vernon Smith was nearer to the people and more their brother than he had been in his whole high-stepping, pedantic existence. For if he did not love a poor man, he hated one, and you never really regard a labourer as your equal till you can quarrel with him. "Dirty cad," he muttered, "filthy fool, mucking with snow like a beastly baby. When will they be civilized? Why, the very state of the street is a disgrace and a temptation to such tomfools. Why isn't all this snow cleared away, and the street made decent?" To the eye of efficiency there was indeed something to complain of in the conditions of the road. Snow was banked up on both sides in white walls, and toward the other, the darker end of the street, even rose into a chaos of low, colourless hills. By the time he reached them he was nearly knee-deep, and was in a far from philanthropic frame of mind. The solitude of the little streets was as strange as their white obstruction, and before he had ploughed his way much further he was convinced that he had taken a wrong turning and fallen upon some formless suburb unvisited before. There was no light in any of the low dark houses, no light in anything but the blank emphatic snow. He was a modern and morbid. Hellish isolation hit and held him suddenly. Anything human would have relieved the strain, if it had been only the leap of a garroteur. Then the tender human touch came indeed, for another snowball struck him and made a star on his back. He turned with a fierce joy and ran after a boy, escaping. Ran with dizzy and violent speed, he knew not for how long. He wanted the boy. He did not know whether he loved or hated him. He wanted humanity. He did not know whether he loved or hated it. As he ran he realized that the landscape around him was changing in shape, though not in colour. The houses seemed to dwindle and disappear in hills of snow, as if buried. The snow seemed to rise in tattered outlines of crag and cliff and crest. But he thought of nothing of all these impossibilities until the boy turned to bay. When he did, he saw the child was queerly beautiful, with gold-red hair and a face as serious as complete happiness. And when he spoke to the boy his own question surprised him, for he said for the first time in his life, "What am I doing here?" And the little boy, with very grave eyes, answered, "I suppose you are dead." He had also for the first time a doubt of his spiritual destiny. He looked round on a towering landscape of frozen peaks and plains, and said, "Is this hell?" And the child stared but did not answer. He knew it was heaven. All over that colossal country, white as the world round the pole, little boys were playing, rolling each other down dreadful slopes, crushing each other under falling cliffs. For heaven is a place where one can fight for ever without hurting. Smith suddenly remembered how happy he had been as a child, rolling about on the safe sand hills around Conway. Right above Smith's head, higher than the cross of St. Paul, but curving over him like the hanging blossom of a harebell, was a cavernous crag of snow. 100 feet below him, like a landscape seen from a balloon, lay snowy flats as white and as far away. He saw a little boy stagger with many catastrophic slides to that toppling peak, and seizing another little boy by the leg, send him flying away down to the distant silver plains. There he sank and vanished in the snow as if in the sea, but coming up again like a diver, rushed madly up the steep once more, rolling before him a great gathering snowball, gigantic at last, which he hurled back at the mountain crest, and brought both the boy and the mountain down in one avalanche to the level of the vale. The other boy also sank like a stone, and also rose again like a bird. But Smith had no leisure to concern himself with this, for the collapse of that celestial crest had left him standing solitary in the sky on a peak like a church spire. He could see the tiny figures of the boys in the valley below, and he knew by their attitudes that they were eagerly telling him to jump. Then, for the first time, he knew the nature of faith, as he had just known the fierce nature of charity. Or rather, for the second time, for he remembered one moment when he had known faith before. It was when his father had taught him to swim, and he had believed he could float on water, not only against reason, but what is so much harder, against instinct. Then he had trusted water, now he must trust air. He jumped. He went through air and then through snow with the same blinding swiftness, but as he buried himself in solid snow like a bullet, he seemed to learn a million things, and to learn them all too fast. He knew that the whole world is a snowball, and that all the stars are snowballs. He knew that no man will be fit for heaven till he loves solid whiteness as a little boy loves a ball of snow. He sank, and he sank, and he sank, and then, as usually happens in such cases, woke up with a start in the street. True, he was taken up for a common drunk, but if you properly appreciate his conversion, you will appreciate that he did not mind, since the crime of drunkenness is infinitely less than that of spiritual pride of which he had really been guilty. End of section 12, chapters 37 through 39. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Alarms and Discursions by G.K. Chesterton. Section 13, chapters 37 through 39. The High Plains. By high plains I do not mean tablelands. Tablelands do not interest one very much. They seem to involve the bore of a climb without the pleasure of a peak. Also, they are vaguely associated with Asia and those enormous armies that eat up everything like locusts, as did the army of Xerxes, with emperors from nowhere spreading their battalions everywhere, with the white elephants and the painted horses, the dark engines and the dreadful mounted bowmen of the moving empires of the East, with all that evil insolence, in short, that rolled into Europe in the youth of Nero, and after having been battered about and abandoned by one Christian nation after another, turned up in England with Disraeli, and was christened, or rather paganed, Imperialism. Also, it may be necessary to explain, I do not mean high plains, such as the Theosophists and the higher thought centres talk about. They spell theirs differently, but I will not have theirs in any spelling. They, I know, are always expounding how this or that person is on a lower plane, while they, the speakers, are on a higher plane. Sometimes they will almost tell you what plane, as in 5994 or plane F subplane 304. I do not mean this sort of height either. My religion says nothing about such planes, except that all men are on one plane, and that by no means a higher one. There are saints indeed in my religion, but a saint only means a man who really knows he is a sinner. Why, then, should I talk of the planes as high? I do it for a rather singular reason, which I will illustrate by a parallel. When I was at school, learning all the Greek I have ever forgotten, I was puzzled by the phrase oinon milon, that is, black wine, which continually occurred. I asked what it meant, and many most interesting and convincing answers were given. It was pointed out that we know little of the actual liquid drunk by the Greeks, that the analogy of modern Greek wines may suggest that it was dark and sticky, perhaps a sort of syrup always taken with water, that archaic language about colour is always a little dubious, as where Homer speaks of the wine dark sea, and so on. I was very properly satisfied, and never thought of the matter again until one day, having a decanter of claret in front of me, I happened to look at it. I then perceived that they called wine black because it is black. Very thin, diluted, or held up abruptly against a flame, red wine is red. But seen in body, in most normal shades and semi-lights, red wine is black, and therefore was called so. On the same principles I call the planes high, because the planes always are high. They are always as high as we are. We talk of climbing mountain crest and looking down at the plain, but the phrase is an illusion of our arrogance. It is impossible even to look down at the plain, for the plain itself rises as we rise. It is not merely true that the higher we climb, the wider and wider is spread out below us the wealth of the world. It is not merely that Devil or some other respectable guide for tourists takes us to the top of an exceedingly high mountain and shows us all the kingdoms of the earth. It is more than that in our real feeling of it. It is that, in a sense, the whole world rises with us, roaring, and accompanies us to the crest, like some clanging chorus of eagles. The plains rise higher and higher, like swift grey walls piled up against invisible invaders, and however high a peak you climb, the plain is still as high as the peak. The mountain tops are only noble because from them we are privileged to behold the plains. So the only value in any man being superior is that he may have a superior admiration for the level and the common. If there is any profit in a place craggy and precipitous, it is only because from the vale it is not so easy to see all the beauty of the vale, because when actually in the flats one cannot see their sublime and satisfying flatness. If there is any value in being educated or eminent, which is doubtful enough, it is only because the best instructed man may feel most swiftly and certainly the splendour of the ignorant and the simple, the full magnificence of that mighty human army in the plains. The general goes up to the hill to look at his soldiers, not to look down at his soldiers. He withdraws himself, not because his regiment is too small to be touched, but because it is too mighty to be seen. The chief climbs with submission or goes higher with great humility, since, in order to take a bird's-eye view of everything, he must become small and distant like a bird. The most marvellous of those mystical cavaliers who wrote intricate and exquisite verse in England in the 17th century, I mean Henry Vaughan, put the matter in one line, intrinsically immortal and practically forgotten: O holy hope and high humility. That adjective high is not only one of the sudden and stunning inspirations of literature, it is also one of the greatest and gravest definitions of moral science. However far aloft a man may go, he is still looking up, not only at God, which is obvious, but in a manner at men also, seeing more and more all that is towering and mysterious in the dignity and destiny of the lonely house of Adam. I wrote some part of these rambling remarks on a high ridge of rock and turf overlooking a stretch of the central counties. The rise was slight enough in reality, but the immediate ascent had been so steep and sudden that one could not avoid the fancy that on reaching the summit one would look down at the stars. But one did not look down at the stars, but rather up at the cities, seeing as high in heaven the palace town of Alfred like a lit sunset cloud, and away in the void spaces, like a planet in eclipse, Salisbury. So it may be hoped, until we die, you and I will always look up rather than down at the labours and the habitations of our race. We will lift up our eyes to the valleys from whence cometh our help. For from every special eminence and beyond every sublime landmark it is good for our souls to see only vaster and vaster visions of that dizzy and divine level, and to behold from our crumbling turrets the tall plains of equality. The Chorus. One of the most marked instances of the decline of true popular sympathy is the gradual disappearance in our time of the habit of singing in chorus. Even when it is done nowadays, it is done tentatively and sometimes inaudibly, apparently upon some preposterous principle which I have never clearly grasped, that singing is an art. In the new aristocracy of the drawing-room a lady is actually asked whether she sings. In the old democracy of the dinner-table a man was simply told to sing, and he had to do it. I like the atmosphere of those old banquets. I like to think of my ancestors, middle-aged or venerable gentlemen, all sitting round the table and explaining that they would never forget old days or friends, with a rumpty-iddity-iddy, or letting it be known that they would die for England's glory with their tooral, etc. Even the vices of that society, which sometimes, I fear, rendered the narrative portions of the song almost as cryptic and inarticulate as the chorus, were displayed with a more human softening than the same vices in the saloon bars of our own time. I greatly prefer Mr. Richard Swiveller to Mr. Stanley Ortheris. I prefer the man who exceeded in rosy wine in order that the wing of friendship might never moult a feather, to the man who exceeds quite as much in whiskies and sodas, but declares all the time that he's for number one, and that you don't catch him paying for other men's drinks. The old men of pleasure, with their tooral, at least got some social and communal virtue out of pleasure. The new men of pleasure, without the slightest vestige of a tooral, are simply hermits of irreligion instead of religion, anchorites of atheism, and they might as well be drugging themselves with hashish or opium in a wilderness. But the chorus of the old songs had another use besides this obvious one of asserting the popular element in the arts. The chorus of a song, even of a comic song, has the same purpose as the chorus of a Greek tragedy. It reconciles men to the gods. It connects this one particular tale with the cosmos and the philosophy of common things. Thus we constantly find in the old ballads, especially the pathetic ballads, some refrain about the grass growing green, or the birds singing, or the woods being merry in spring. These are windows opened in the house of tragedy, momentary glimpses of larger and quieter scenes, of more ancient and enduring landscapes. Many of the country songs describing crime and death have refrains of a startling joviality like cock-crow, just as if the whole company were coming in with a shout of protest against so sombre a view of existence. There is a long and gruesome ballad called The Berkshire Tragedy, about a murder committed by a jealous sister, for the consummation of which a wicked miller is hanged, and the course which should come in a kind of burst runs, "And I'll be true to my love, if my love will be true to me." The very reasonable arrangement here suggested is introduced, I think, as a kind of throw-back to the normal, as a reminder that even the Berkshire tragedy does not fill the whole of Berkshire. The poor young lady is drowned, and the wicked miller, to whom we may have been affectionately attached, is hanged. But still a ruby kindles in the vine, and many a garden by the water blows. Not that Omar's type of hedonistic resignation is at all the same as the breezy impatience of the Berkshire refrain, but they are alike in so far as they gaze out beyond the particular complication to more open plains of peace. The chorus of the ballad looks past the drowning maiden and the miller's gibbet, and sees the lanes full of lovers. This use of the chorus to humanize and dilute a dark story is strongly opposed to the modern view of art. Modern art has to be what is called intense. It is not easy to define being intense, but roughly speaking it means saying only one thing at a time and saying it wrong. Modern tragic writers have to write short stories. If they wrote long stories, as the man said of philosophy, cheerfulness would creep in. Such stories are like stings, brief but purely painful, and doubtless they bore some resemblance to some lives lived under our successful scientific civilization, lives which tend in any case to be painful and in many cases to be brief. But when the artistic people passed beyond the poignant anecdote and began to write long books full of poignancy, then the reading public began to rebel and to demand the recall of romance. The long books about the black poverty of cities became quite insupportable. The Berkshire tragedy had a chorus, but the London tragedy had no chorus. Therefore people welcomed the return of adventurous novels about alien places and times, the trenchant and sword-like stories of Stevenson. But I am not narrowly on the side of the romantics. I think that glimpses of the gloom of our civilization ought to be recorded. I think that the bewilderments of the solitary and sceptical soul ought to be preserved, if it be only for the pity, yes, and the admiration, of the happier time. But I wish that there were some way in which the chorus could enter. I wish that at the end of each chapter of stiff agony or insane terror, the choir of humanity could come in with a crash of music and tell both reader and author that this is not the whole of human experience. Let them go on recording hard scenes or hideous questions, but let there be a jolly refrain. Thus we might read, as Honoria laid down the volume of Ibsen and went wearily to her window, she realized that life must be to her not only harsher but colder than it was to the comfortable and weak. With her Tyrrell, Orel, etc., or again, the young curate smiled grimly as he listened to his great-grandmother's last words. He knew only too well that since Fogg's discovery of the hereditary hairiness of goats religion stood on a very different basis from that which it had occupied in his childhood, with his rump-biddy, and so on. Or we might read, Uriel Maybloom stared gloomily down at his sandals as he realized for the first time how senseless and antisocial are all ties between man and woman, how each must go his way or her way without any attempt to arrest the headlong separation of their souls. And then would come in one deafening chorus of everlasting humanity, but I'll be true to my love if my love will be true to me. In the records of the first majestic and yet fantastic developments of the foundations of St. Francis of Assisi is an account of a certain blessed brother Giles. I have forgotten most of it, but I remember one fact, that certain students of theology came to ask him whether he believed in free will, and if so, how could he reconcile it with necessity. On hearing the question, St. Francis's follower reflected a little while, and then seized a fiddle and began capering and dancing about the garden, playing a wild tune and generally expressing a violent and invigorating indifference. The tune is not recorded, but it is the eternal chorus of mankind that modifies all the arts and mocks all the individualism, like the laughter and thunder of some distant sea. A romance of the marshes. In books, as a whole, marshes are described as desolate and colourless, great fields of clay or sedge, vast horizons of drab or grey. But this, like many other literary associations, is a piece of poetical injustice. Monotony has nothing to do with a place. Monotony, either in its sensation or its infliction, is simply the quality of a person. There are no dreary sights, there are only dreary sightseers. It is a matter of taste, that of personality, whether marshes are monotonous, but it is a matter of fact and science that they are not monochrome. The tops of high mountains, I am told, are all white. The depths of primeval caverns, I am also told, are all dark. The sea will be grey or blue for weeks together, and the desert, I have been led to believe, is the colour of sand. The North Pole, if we found it, would be white with cracks of blue, and endless space, if we went there, would, I suppose, be black with white spots. If any of these were counted of a monotonous colour, I could well understand it, but on the contrary they are always spoken of as if they had the gorgeous and chaotic colours of a cosmic kaleidoscope. Now exactly where you can find colours like those of a tulip garden or a stained glass window is in those sunken and sodden lands which are always called dreary. Of course the great tulip gardens did arise in Holland, which is simply one immense marsh. There is nothing in Europe so truly tropical as marshes. Also, now I come to think of it, there are few places so agreeably marshy as tropics. At any rate, swamp and fenlands in England are always especially rich in gay grasses or gorgeous fungoids, and seem sometimes as glorious as a transformation scene, but also as unsubstantial. In these splendid scenes it is always very easy to put your foot through the scenery. You may sink up to your armpits, but you will sink up to your armpits in flowers. I do not deny that I myself am of a sort that sinks. Except in the matter of spirits, I saw in the West Counties recently a swampy field of great richness and promise. If I had stepped on it, I have no doubt at all that I should have vanished, that aeons hence the complete fossil of a fat Fleet Street journalist would be found in that compressed clay. I only claim that it would be found in some attitude of energy, or even of joy. But the last point is the most important of all, for as I imagined myself sinking up to the neck in what looked like solid green field, I suddenly remembered that this very thing must have happened to certain interesting pirates quite 1,000 years ago. For as it happened, the flat fenland in which I nearly sunk was the fenland round the island of Athelney, which is now an island in the fields and no longer in the waters. But on the abrupt hillock a stone still stands to say that this was that embattled islet in the Parrett where King Alfred held his last fort against the foreign invaders in that war that nearly washed us as far from civilization as the Solomon Islands. Here he defended the island called Athelney, as he afterwards did his best to defend the island called England. For the hero always defends an island, a thing beleaguered and surrounded, like the Troy of Hector, and the highest and largest humanitarian can only rise to defending the tiny island called the earth. One approaches the island of Athelney along a long, low road like an interminable white string, stretched across the flats and lined with those dwarfish trees that are elvish in their very dullness. At one point of the journey, I cannot conceive why, one is arrested by a toll gate at which one has to pay 3 pence. Perhaps it is a distorted tradition of those dark ages. Perhaps Alfred, with his superior science of comparative civilizations, had calculated the economics of Denmark down to the halfpenny. Perhaps a Dane sometimes came with 2 pence, sometimes even with 2 pence halfpenny, after the sack of many cities, even with 2 pence 3 farthings, but never with 3 pence. Whether or no it was a permanent barrier to the barbarians, it was only a temporary barrier to me. I discovered 3 large and complete coppers in various parts of my person, and I passed on along that strangely monotonous and strangely fascinating path. It is not merely fanciful to feel that the place expresses itself appropriately as the place where the great Christian king hid himself from the heathen. Though a marshland is always open, it is still curiously secret. Fens, like deserts, are large things, very apt to be mislaid. These flats feared to be overlooked in a double sense. The small trees crouched, and the whole plain seemed lying on its face, as men do when shells burst. The little path ran fearlessly forward, but it seemed to run on all fours. Everything in that strange countryside seemed to be lying low, as if to avoid the incessant and rattling rain of the Danish arrows. There were indeed hills of no inconsiderable height quite within call, but those pools and flats of the old Parrett seemed to separate themselves like a central and secret sea, and in the midst of them stood up the rock of Athelney, as isolate as it was to Alfred. And all across this recumbent and almost crawling country there ran the glory of the low wet lands, grass lustrous and living like the plumage of some universal bird, the flowers as gorgeous as bonfires, and the weeds more beautiful than the flowers. One stooped to stroke the grass as if the earth were all one kind beast that could feel. Why does no decent person write an historical novel about Alfred at his fort in Athelney in the marshes of the Parrett? Not a very historical novel, not about his truth-telling, please, or his founding the British Empire, or the British Navy, or the Navy League, or whichever it was he founded. Not about the Treaty of Wedmore, and whether it ought, as an eminent historian says, to be called the Pact of Chippenham. But an aboriginal romance for boys about the bare, bald, beatific fact that a great hero held his fort at an island in a river. An island is fine enough in all conscience or piratic unconsciousness, but an island in the river sounds like the beginning of the greatest adventure story on earth. Robinson Crusoe is really a great tale, but think of Robinson Crusoe's feelings if he could have actually seen England and Spain from his inaccessible isle. Treasure Island is a spirit of genius, but what treasure could an island contain to compare with Alfred? And then consider the further elements of juvenile romance in an island that was more of an island than it looked. Athelney was masked with marshes. Many a heavy harnessed Viking may have started bounding across a meadow only to find himself submerged in a sea. I feel the full fictitious splendour spreading round me. I see glimpses of a great romance that will never be written. I see a sudden shaft quivering one of the short trees. I see a red-haired man wading madly among the tall gold flowers of the marshes, leaping onward and lurching lower. I see another shaft quivering in his throat. I cannot see any more, because, as I have delicately suggested, I am a heavy man. This mysterious marshland does not sustain me, and I sink into its depths with a bubbling groan. End of section 13, chapters 37 through 39. End of G.K. Chesterton's Alarms and Discursions.